All right, I know you're probably looking at the time and thought that was the last speaker, but don't worry, mine is relatively short, so we'll still finish on time. As you know, we've been here talking about the Emerging Technologies report, and I am, I guess, the facilitator of Chapter 7, which is actual application of 3D printing, 3D printed concrete from the first talk. And essentially what we're looking at here is case studies. So if you just walked into the room, what is this EMT report? It's basically summarizing the state of the art with respect to 3D printing of concrete. This report is being led by ACI Committee 564, which is 3D printing. And there's a subcommittee, which Claudiane is the chair of, that is actually leading this emerging technology report. There's 8 different chapters. Chapter 7 is the case studies chapter. And this is just, it's not a real picture. You can't obtain it yet. We're still in the process of developing the document. All right, so chapter 7 is the goal of this chapter is to generate an in-depth, multifaceted understanding of complex issues in its real-life context. And there was a lot of discussion in the committee about, did we just want to limit it to field applications? Did we want to limit it to lab applications? And essentially we decided that we don't want to constrain ourselves, and we're going to open it up to field and lab, because a lot of questions come in from people who are trying to perhaps develop quality control tests in the lab, and they want to scale it up to the field. So essentially, if you printed something with cementitious materials, mortar, paste, or concrete, we would love to have information about it. And with respect to this presentation in itself, I'm really just going to discuss the process that we are using to develop this chapter. And the great thing about being here in this space at this particular time is that you have a chance to provide input on what you think is needed with respect to case studies. So with respect to the chapter development, first we had to decide what information we wanted to collect. And I should also mention that John Belkowitz was actually the first lead of this chapter. So he spent a lot of time trying to think about what information to collect. And then we was trying to decide, how do we want to collect this information? And then of course we need to solicit everybody to get these case studies. We want to synthesize that information, and then this will be balloted. So as with all chapters in ACI, we do have to go through the balloting process with that. So the way that we decided to gather the information was to create an interactive form. So over here you can see this form. We're collecting front matter from the people that's going to submit it. We're asking for information about the name of the project. And anything with the star here is information that you have to include. After that, everything else is up to the person who wants to submit. Right? So you can see over here is how would you classify the project. Again, we're trying to separate them into what we would consider to be like lab-based projects versus field-based projects. What is your print area? There's a lot of discussion about also kind of using the print area as a way to kind of like double check if it's a lab or a field-based project. We want to know who is actually submitting this, because that could also provide us some insight about perhaps how things were stated. And then we have the details section, which is everything about the project, right? We want people to give us some information about the project, the location, the type of construction, the objectives of the project. We think that would be really interesting. And specifically, why did you decide to select 3D printing for the project? So that's another place you have to reply. After that, there's a couple of questions about what percentage of the project was actually printed off-site and on-site. As we know that you can print on-site, you could also use it as a prefab type of application. So that is what this information is trying to gather, whether it's 100% was printed on-site, whether the 0% was printed on-site, as well as, printed off-site and on-site, yes, so that is fine. So hopefully these two numbers should add up, right? And then over here, you're using this section to provide information about mixed design and mixed proportion. We discussed a lot about having like little bins with respect to like cement type, but then we decided to make it open-ended so that people could put in as much or as little information they decided that they wanted to include. We want some information about the construction process and printing process. And then we want information about their fresh state properties. Were there any specific targets that they was trying to reach or achieve with it? Next, we have a section with respect to hardened state properties. We want to know information about what type of quality control procedures are being used. And then we have an open space in which people can provide information about anything else that perhaps we didn't directly ask that question for. Oh, no, that's not what that is. They can ask to answer questions here about the type of printer, how long it took, so just a little bit more free response questions. We want to know about lessons learned from doing the project, and what would they have adjusted, right? So what was your insights and what would you have adjusted, knowing now what you know? And then what advice and recommendations do you have for others? And then the last question is, what code specifications or available resources did you find to be helpful with respect to doing your project? And then finally, we have a space where we want people to upload a figure, table, something that is representative of the project. Again, you don't have to, but we know that images are always great for conveying information. And then if your project has been published someplace, or if you have it on the website, we definitely want that information too. And then this is the section where people could just add information about anything else. So again, this is the state of the art report, right? So we're really looking for information that has not really been published anyplace else, right? Because we're trying to capture the current state of the art, particularly what's been happening, let's say, within the last 5 years or so. But in addition to getting case studies from people, there will be some select literature mining, and really more so here is to try to gather perhaps some information that we're not necessarily gathering from the case studies. So for example, there was a proceeding that was published in which X3C talked about 3 different case studies that they did. And in this particular case, they talked about different projects. So one was on an artificial reef. And in that case study, they talked about the challenge with respect to printing at a particular angle, which I think could be some interesting information. They talked about stormwater collectors and how that particular project was able to reduce, reduce, I guess, interruptions to the public. So it was reduced from 2 weeks to 2 days. And then they talked about some other projects, right? So really looking for mining the literature for unique case studies. One of the issues, though, with mining the literature is copyright issues. And that's why we really need to rely on everyone here that if you have done something, to submit it, because there are copyright issues with respect to using, information that came from other published sources. Over here, this is another case study that was essentially comparing 9 different companies from the U.S., from Hong Kong. And in this particular paper, I thought what was interesting about it is that they used the information from these different companies to estimate information about thermal bridging effects of a particular wall system as well as structural resistance. So again, this is I would say a novel use of something that has happened in the literature already in order to provide more insight into the case study chapter. But again, this is something that has already been published, so there may be some copyright issues behind this. Okay, so once we gather all the information, what do we plan to do with it? We plan to just essentially publish each case study as is. Of course, there'll be some copy editing involved in terms of making sure things are consistent. And then I think one of the key things is to utilize this information and synthesize it, right? So at the very end, we're going to do a comparison of the commonalities and differences with respect to these various projects, and then summarize key findings with respect to the case studies. All right, so where are we now, right? This is your particular call for action. We are in the process of collecting case studies. We are now in this soliciting case study section. If you have printed anything, we invite you to go to this link, scan the QR code, so that way you can be included in this state of the art report. In addition, if there's some information that you felt like was not included in the form and you really think it would be important for us to include with respect to the case studies, please reach out to myself or Claudiane so we can include that into it. That is all that I have. Like I said, it was going to be short and sweet. This is just a time to give you some information about what is happening. And if you have any questions for me with 1 minute left, we can entertain that. Yeah. So the survey was sent out through 564, but I definitely think we need to publicize it more and to send it out to like all the subcommittees and just really be blasting people. Yeah. All right. Thank you.